Daniel Brooks hadn't walked through the front door of Brooks General Market without fanfare in over a decade. For the past 15 years, he'd been the face of the company, a trusted name in the community, known for shaking hands with loyal customers and hosting town events in the store's parking lot. But today was different. The man who entered the store that morning was not the sharply dressed owner in his tailored navy suits. Instead, he wore scuffed sneakers, faded jeans, and a hoodie that hadn't seen daylight in years. His normally slicked-back hair was tucked under a baseball cap, and his clean-shaven face was hidden beneath a few days' worth of stubble. He didn't want to be noticed. That was the point. For months, Daniel had been wrestling with a quiet but persistent anxiety. The store's sales reports looked healthy. On paper, the numbers were consistent with previous years. Yet profits were vanishing like smoke. Despite rising prices and a loyal customer base, margins were shrinking, and expenses weren't explaining the shortfall. Late-night reviews of spreadsheets had turned into obsessive audits, but no matter how deep he dug, nothing added up. He'd built this business from a single shelf in a rented unit to a bustling community marketplace with multiple departments and a trusted reputation. Now it was bleeding money, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was stealing from him. The decision to go undercover wasn't made lightly. Daniel had always believed in empowering his team, in treating them like family, and giving them the freedom to run the store with autonomy. He wasn't a micromanager. But now, that trust felt fragile. There were whispers he couldn't hear from the corner office, behaviors he might never notice if he entered with a name badge and a clipboard. So, for the first time since the grand opening, he chose to walk the aisles not as the owner, but as an anonymous observer. He arrived before sunrise, when only the opening crew would be present and foot traffic would be light. It was the perfect time to blend in. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door gave its familiar soft chime. The air smelled of coffee and citrus cleaner, a nostalgic combination that used to bring him comfort. Today, it only made his chest tighten. His eyes scanned the store quickly, instinctively noting details. A few customers were already browsing, carts rolling quietly across the polished floor. Everything looked clean, organized, exactly the kind of store he'd spent years cultivating. But Daniel knew too well that appearances could lie. He walked slowly past the produce section, lingering by the apples and pretending to read a label, his peripheral vision tracking the employees on duty. His heart beat faster when he spotted them. Linda, the store's lead cashier, was training a new hire at the register. Her voice carried through the space, clear and confident, just as he remembered it. Across the store, Chris, his stockroom veteran, was arranging cereal boxes on the shelf, joking with a customer about the best flavor of granola. These were people he'd celebrated birthdays with, people he'd hugged during hard times. It was hard to imagine any of them betraying the business. But that's exactly what made the possibility so painful. Daniel continued to walk the aisles in silence, his hands brushing shelves and displays that once filled him with pride, now only reminding him of what might be slipping through his fingers. A young woman with a toddler passed by him in the juice aisle. He nodded politely, ducking his head slightly, unsure if she might recognize him. She didn't. That, too, was unsettling. Had he really become so removed from the daily rhythm of the store that he was just another face in the crowd? He'd always prided himself on knowing his customers, their names, their favorite brands, even the snacks their kids liked. But time, success, and growth had changed things. Now, he was just a ghost in his own creation, walking hallways he'd helped build among people who no longer looked up when he passed. Still, this was the only way he would learn the truth. If theft was happening under his nose, it wasn't going to be found on a spreadsheet. It would be hidden in gestures, quiet words, patterns of behavior too subtle for a security camera or an end-of-day report. Daniel knew he had to be patient, so he stood near the magazine rack, pretending to flip through pages while listening to the cadence of the store. The beep of scanners, the soft greetings at checkout, the muted conversations between staff. It all seemed normal. But deep down, Daniel Brooks knew. He hadn't come this far on gut feeling alone. Something was wrong at Brooks General Market, And by the end of the day, he would begin to see just how deep the cracks in his foundation truly went. Daniel lingered near the entrance of Brooks General Market, adjusting the brim of his cap as he scanned the familiar yet oddly foreign landscape of his own store. Morning light filtered through the large glass windows, casting long, soft beams across the polished floors and neatly arranged displays. The quiet hum of freezers, the occasional beep from the checkout scanners, and the murmur of early customers formed a background symphony he once found comforting. But today, it all sounded hollow. Each familiar detail, once a source of pride, now felt like a potential camouflage for deceit. He turned his gaze toward the front registers, where Linda, the head cashier, was training a new hire with her usual warm authority. Linda had been with the store for nearly 7 years. She was one of the first employees Daniel had hired when expansion turned his one-man operation into a full-scale marketplace. Her confidence was reassuring, and customers liked her. From where Daniel stood, she seemed unchanged, still wearing her navy blue vest with pride, still coaching new hires with patience and clarity. He watched as she demonstrated how to process returns, her tone upbeat and professional. But Daniel couldn't shake the unease forming in the pit of his stomach. Was this the same woman who had laughed with his kids during the staff BBQ? Or had time created layers he hadn't seen? Further down aisle 4, Chris, the stock clerk, was joking with a customer while organizing cereal boxes. His easygoing charm had made him a favorite among shoppers. Daniel watched as Chris offered to check the back for a sold-out granola flavor, jogging toward the storeroom with practiced energy. On the surface, it looked like great customer service, but Daniel noticed something. Chris hadn't scanned the shelf tags or updated the out-of-stock indicator. It was a small detail, easily dismissed. Still, it added a subtle note of dissonance in the otherwise harmonious scene. In Daniel's experience, the truth often lived in those kinds of details. A woman with salt and pepper hair approached from the bread aisle, pushing a cart filled with household staples and a bouquet of tulips. Daniel recognized her instantly, Mrs. Walker, a loyal customer for over a decade. She used to bring cookies for the staff every December and always asked about his mother's health when they chatted. Now she walked past him without a flicker of recognition. Her eyes didn't pause, her smile didn't flicker, and Daniel realized she had no idea who he was. It shouldn't have surprised him. He'd been out of the public eye for years, but it still struck a chord. The man she used to greet at the door was now invisible in his own store. This strange sense of disconnection kept following him. He wandered past the dairy aisle, watching employees stock shelves with mechanical efficiency, their interactions rehearsed, polite, and distant. It wasn't just the staff that seemed off. It was the atmosphere. It was too perfect, too composed, as if everyone was playing a part. Daniel had once been able to walk through these aisles and feel the pulse of the store, its energy, its mood, its truth. Now it all felt muted. Every smile seemed a second too late. Every hello felt slightly hollow. No one was doing anything wrong, per se, but it was as if they were hiding in plain sight. Standing near the self-serve coffee station, Daniel watched as 2 employees passed each other near the back end of the store. Their nods were quick, and their conversation, though brief, felt rehearsed. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was off. A manager once told him that silence wasn't always peace. It was sometimes the sound of something being concealed. Daniel now understood that clearly. His instincts, sharpened by years of running a business and building a team, were telling him that beneath the polished floors and friendly greetings, something else was brewing, something calculated. And though no evidence had yet surfaced, Daniel Brooks could feel it in his bones. The cracks were real, and they were widening right under his feet. Daniel had been lingering near the magazine rack for close to 10 minutes, pretending to flip through an issue of Popular Mechanics while keeping his ears open and his eyes fixed just beyond the glossy pages. The early morning bustle was starting to pick up, with more customers trickling in, many of them regulars by the look of it. He kept his posture relaxed, but his focus was razor-sharp. The hum of the checkout lanes played like background music. Beeps, small talk, the rustle of plastic bags. It was all familiar, comforting even, until one voice, low and casual, cut through the noise like a sudden change in tempo. Chris's voice. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, angling his view through the display of chewing gum and tabloids, just enough to catch a clear line of sight to register 3. There, Chris was scanning items for a customer Daniel instantly recognized. Jason Rivera, a long-time patron known for his charisma and sharp suits. Jason came in at least twice a week, always during the early shifts, always buying premium goods, top-shelf coffee beans, organic steaks, imported cleaning supplies. Today was no different. The pile of high-end groceries on the conveyor belt looked more like a boutique haul than a general store run. Daniel watched closely as Chris's hands moved across the screen. At first, everything looked routine. His fingers tapped the touch panel with practiced ease until Daniel noticed a flicker on the digital display. A number flashed, disappeared, then reappeared lower than it had been. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The original total had been north of $120. What Chris announced aloud, however, was $78.50. Daniel's stomach turned. That wasn't a simple override or a promotional code. That was a manual alteration, intentional, specific, and calculated. He strained to listen, pretending to be absorbed in an article about hybrid engines, but Chris's voice carried clearly in the quiet hum of the store. "Man, these inflation-proof prices keep you coming back, huh?" He chuckled as Jason opened his wallet, grinning. "You're a lifesaver, Chris," Jason replied. "These discounts? Unreal." What came next made Daniel's blood run cold. Chris leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Old man Brooks is too busy counting pennies upstairs to ever check the system. As long as it scans, nobody cares." The words hit Daniel like a slap. The casual insult, the assumption of incompetence. It wasn't just theft. It was mockery. It was betrayal disguised as banter. For a moment, Daniel froze. Everything around him blurred. The carts, the lights, the muffled chatter. He stared at Chris. This man he'd once helped cover medical expenses for when Chris's mother had fallen ill. A man he'd defended in a staff meeting when others questioned his overtime requests. That man now stood at the register, using Daniel's name as a punchline, giving away store assets like party favors. Worse, he wasn't even being discreet. "Hey," Jason added with a wink, "my sister's moving into a new place next week. Think she could get the same friends and family discount?" Chris didn't hesitate. "Tell her to come Tuesday or Thursday during my shift. Cameras in aisle 5 have been glitchy for weeks. She'll be fine." He tapped his nose like it was an inside joke. But to Daniel, it was anything but funny. The implications spiraled. Aisle 5's camera had, in fact, been reported for maintenance recently. The request had mysteriously vanished from the system a few days later, and the footage remained unrecovered. At the time, Daniel had chalked it up to an IT hiccup, an irritating but minor concern. Now it was clear. This wasn't a fluke or a one-time shortcut. This was a system, a process, a well-oiled, coordinated act of theft happening in broad daylight. As Jason walked off with his discounted goods, Daniel felt rooted to the floor, his pulse pounding in his ears. He stayed motionless, pretending to browse a row of peppermint gum, every sense on fire. His hands itched to pull out his phone, to start documenting, to confront, but he knew he had to wait. One misstep, and the whole operation could scatter like dust. Instead, he watched the next customer step up, a senior woman with a modest cart. Chris rang up her items with full pricing, smiling politely, no discounts, no flickering screen. The contrast was stark. It wasn't sloppiness. It was selectivity. These deals weren't mistakes. They were rewards for loyalty, favors between trusted friends. Daniel realized this was likely just the tip of the iceberg. His mind raced through past reports, inventory shortages, shrinking margins. Every unexplained variant suddenly had a face, a method, a motive. As he stepped away from the magazine rack, heart heavy and jaw tight, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. They think I'm not watching. But Daniel Brooks was watching now, and he wouldn't look away again. Daniel's legs carried him toward the cleaning aisle, but his mind was still frozen at Register 3. The way Chris had shaved nearly $40 off Jason Rivera's total with just a few taps, and how casually he'd spoken about it, echoed in Daniel's head like a drumbeat. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Worse, he made it sound like a normal part of the job, something everyone knew about, something everyone accepted. Daniel's eyes scanned the shelves in front of him, but he wasn't really seeing the products. He was tracing back every strange discrepancy from the last 6 months, every missing unit, every damaged item logged without follow-up. And as he rounded the corner near the baking supplies, a new voice, cheerful and familiar, snapped him back to the present. Amanda Price, owner of the bakery 2 blocks down, was unloading a full basket at the same register. Amanda was well known in the neighborhood. Her croissants had a cult following, and Daniel himself had been sending people her way for years. She was friendly, generous, and always spoke highly of the store. That was why it stung even more to see her now, leaning comfortably against the counter as Chris scanned her items. Premium baking chocolate, almond flour, imported butter, the kind of ingredients that didn't come cheap. Daniel slowed his steps, stopping just far enough to stay out of her peripheral view. His heart sank when he saw Chris's fingers move quickly again, the same flicker on the screen, the same subtle drop in the total. "You're the best, Chris," Amanda said, smiling as she bagged her items. "The other stores charge twice as much for this stuff. I don't know how I'd keep my bakery running without you." She reached across the counter and gave his forearm a grateful squeeze. Chris just winked and replied, "Well, you know me. Gotta take care of our VIPs. Just keep those cinnamon rolls coming." Then, with a smirk, he added, "And remember, mum's the word. The boss never checks." The phrase was delivered with such ease, such repetition, it sent a chill down Daniel's spine. It wasn't a joke. It was a script that had been rehearsed and recited too many times to count. Daniel had always believed his leadership style, trusting, hands-off, respectful, would inspire loyalty and responsibility. He thought giving employees autonomy would make them feel empowered. But listening to Chris throw his name around like a punchline, he began to see how that very trust had been twisted into a weakness. They hadn't just exploited his system, they had exploited him. The phrase, "the boss never checks," wasn't just about operational gaps, it was an indictment of his entire leadership philosophy. They assumed he'd never look, never question, never suspect. And for too long, they had been right. Amanda walked off with her discounted haul, completely unaware of the war raging behind Daniel's tired eyes. He watched her go, then looked back at Chris, who had already turned his charm to the next customer. Daniel's jaw clenched. This wasn't a one-time slip or an isolated abuse of power. This was a pattern, a network, a calculated operation in which certain customers, likely friends, business contacts, or repeat players, were getting special treatment under the radar. And worse, it was being done with confidence, comfort, and routine. There was nothing haphazard about it. It was intentional, selective, professional. As Daniel stepped away, blending once again into the crowd of morning shoppers, a heaviness settled over him. He now understood that he wasn't just up against theft, he was up against culture, a toxic culture that had taken root beneath the surface of his well-meaning management, Chris's smirk, Amanda's familiarity, the line, "the boss never checks." These weren't the signs of a few bad choices. They were the markers of a system built on quiet permission and shared deception. The store he'd built with integrity and heart had been hollowed out from within. And now, as Daniel turned down the frozen food aisle with a pounding heart and a burning purpose, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was hunting the truth. Daniel moved quietly between the aisles, each step heavier than the last. The more he saw, the more the weight of it pressed into his chest like a slow-building avalanche. Moments ago, he'd witnessed Amanda walk out with a basket of discounted baking goods, a transaction glossed over with the same casual confidence as Jason's. Chris's smirking repetition of "the boss never checks" had echoed in his ears, as Daniel wandered deeper into the store. He wasn't even sure where he was going anymore. His legs took him toward the break area near the back, a corner he used to walk through during morning check-ins when he still made those rounds. It was quieter here, behind the bustle of the front registers, where whispers carried a little farther and secrets sometimes surfaced. That's when he heard Linda's voice. She stood just outside the employee hallway, coffee cup in hand, talking to Chris in a tone low enough to sound private, but not private enough for Daniel to miss if he listened carefully. "You've got to space out the overrides more," she was saying, her voice calm, almost motherly. "Too many in a row starts to look weird in the system." Chris, leaning on the counter with a relaxed grin, nodded as if they were discussing weather patterns, not how to avoid detection in a theft operation. "Right," he said. "It's just, you know, when the regulars line up, it gets tempting to run them through quick." Linda chuckled and shook her head. "Tempting or not, we're not amateurs. Blend it in, Chris. Keep it clean." Her tone was seasoned, rehearsed. Daniel felt a wave of nausea rise. Linda, his longest-serving cashier, the one who helped design their point-of-sale training, wasn't just involved. She was managing it. Before Daniel could process the betrayal, another voice joined the conversation. Mark, one of the backroom staffers, stepped out from the hallway, wiping his hands on a rag. "Speaking of clean," he said casually, "I handled that camera issue last week. Deleted the backup files before they could flag anything. Told Ethan it was a glitch during the update." Chris laughed, bumping fists with him. "You're a lifesaver, man." Daniel's blood ran cold. That camera issue, aisle 5, the one mentioned earlier, he had blamed on outdated software. Mark had smiled and nodded when Daniel asked about it last week. Now he stood there, bragging about erasing surveillance footage like he'd tossed out expired milk. "No worries," Mark added. "As long as we stay ahead of the logs, we're good. Tech's on our side." Daniel leaned against a shelf just out of view, his mind spinning. This wasn't a team of employees bending rules to survive. This was a coordinated network, a system of inside players with defined roles and unspoken codes. One adjusted the pricing, another managed the visual evidence, and Linda, the one he'd once called the heartbeat of the front end, was guiding it all. His heart ached at the thought of every staff birthday he'd remembered, every family emergency he'd helped cover, every time he'd said yes without hesitation. What had he been enabling? And what else had he missed? Just then, a new voice broke through the fog. "Hey, Linda," came a shy but eager tone. Daniel peered through a crack in the shelf and spotted Jake, the newest hire, barely 19, fresh-faced, nervous. He held a box of restocked candy under one arm and looked between Chris and Linda like a kid approaching the cool kids at school. "I've been meaning to ask," Jake continued, his voice lowering. "Some of my friends said there's like a discount thing that you can do if people come in at the right time?" For a second, no one spoke. Then Chris shot Linda a look. Linda, without missing a beat, smiled softly. "Jake," she said, "we don't talk about that in the open. But since you asked, let's have a quick chat after your shift. I'll walk you through the, proper customer service techniques." The meaning behind her words was unmistakable. Daniel turned away, pressing his back to the metal shelf to keep from being seen. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from fury. Quiet, contained, bitter fury. They were recruiting, actively bringing new people into the fold. The scheme had gone from a risky secret among trusted hands to a growing enterprise within his walls. And Jake, just a kid trying to find his place, was being invited into a culture of corruption as if it were a rite of passage. Daniel felt the foundation of his business, the trust, the loyalty, the culture he'd spent years nurturing, splinter under the weight of what he'd just heard. This wasn't just theft. This was betrayal dressed in routine, wrapped in smiles, and passed along like an inside joke. He now understood fully. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was the whole tree rotting from the inside out. Daniel waited until the break room hallway cleared before quietly slipping into the back corner of the store, settling himself near the pet supplies section. one of the few areas out of direct sight from the registers and cameras. His pulse hadn't slowed since he overheard Linda inviting Jake into their twisted version of customer service training. The betrayal had moved from a suspicion to a revelation, and now into something more dangerous, an active operation, expanding beneath his nose like a slow-burning fire. He crouched beside a bottom shelf of dog food bags, pulled out his phone, and opened the store's management app, an expensive tool he had invested in just last year at Linda's recommendation, meant to increase oversight and streamline efficiency. Now he would see whether the system designed to prevent chaos had instead been engineered to conceal it. The app loaded, and Daniel navigated directly to the transaction logs. His fingers moved with purpose, decades of retail experience guiding his search. First, he filtered by price override entries, those times when employees manually altered the price of an item at checkout. The list was longer than it should have been. He narrowed it to the past 3 months, then sorted it by employee ID. Linda's name appeared again and again. So did Chris's. Each override was attached to high-value items, premium coffee beans, organic meats, imported olive oils, luxury soaps. Daniel tapped into the records. Original price, $22.99. Final sale, $9. Another, originally $38.49, reduced to $11.25. The pattern wasn't just troubling, it was surgical. It wasn't just that they were giving discounts, it was how cleanly they were doing it. He cross-checked the timing of the overrides with shift schedules. Tuesdays, Thursdays, early mornings, exactly the windows Chris had recommended to Jason Rivera. Daniel's heart began to race. It wasn't a coincidence, it was protocol. His mind darted to the corrupted security footage, always from those exact time blocks. He shifted to the void reports, entries made when an item was scanned but later removed from the purchase. The same names surfaced. Dozens of voided items across transactions, sometimes re-added at reduced prices, other times not logged again at all. And then there were the damaged goods reports. That's when it really clicked. Dozens of entries, often logged within minutes of large transactions, listing high-margin products as unsellable. Coffee, filet mignon, premium chocolate, all written off, all gone from the shelves, but never returned to inventory. Daniel remembered the morning when Chris told him they had to discard an entire case of gluten-free pancake mix due to a shipping mishap. The math hadn't made sense even then, but Daniel had let it go. Now he saw the entry. 24 units marked as damaged, logged under Linda's credentials, time-stamped on the same day Amanda walked out with her discounted bakery haul. It was a shell game. The product was sold, but the revenue vanished, buried beneath a false report and a false smile. He stared at the screen, his breath shallow, watching as the puzzle completed itself in front of him. The operation was sophisticated. The override percentages varied just enough to avoid triggering alerts. Some discounts were logged manually, others masked as waste. The transactions were scattered just enough to appear random to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Daniel knew. And worse, someone else had known too. Someone who had to have helped them build it. This wasn't the work of employees casually abusing the system. This was an infrastructure of deception designed by someone who understood how to outmaneuver it. Linda had been with him from the beginning. She knew the system protocols, knew where the alert thresholds were, even helped draft the standard override guidelines when they adopted the new software. She'd used her access, her position, and her trust with Daniel to build a blueprint for theft. And Chris had run with it, charming his way through transactions while Mark scrubbed the evidence. The deeper Daniel dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't chaos. It was architecture. Betrayal, built brick by brick, with a confidence that came only from knowing the boss wasn't looking. His thumb hovered over the system alert button. Just one press, and every manager on the payroll would receive a notification about irregular activity. But he paused. If they knew he was onto them, the operation would go underground immediately. Data would be erased. Accounts would be wiped. Daniel had to resist the urge for justice in the moment. Instead, he opened his notes app and began documenting. timestamps, employee IDs, item SKUs, void patterns, shift overlaps. He took screenshots of the most damning evidence and saved them to a hidden folder. He wasn't just compiling proof. He was building a case, one strong enough to expose not just a few dishonest workers, but the entire web they had spun. And as he stared at the numbers blinking on the screen, losses in the tens of thousands, Daniel realized that the true cost wasn't just the money. It was the years of belief, the trust he had poured into people who had quietly burned it all to the ground. Daniel sat tucked behind a stack of bulk dog food bags, his back against the cool metal of the storage shelf, his phone screen illuminating the storm that had been brewing inside his store, one he'd failed to see until now. His eyes flicked across rows of data, each line a tiny fracture in the foundation he once thought unshakable. He refined the filter again, narrowing the date range by weekday and hour. The results were instantaneous and devastating. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, just as Chris had casually told Jason Rivera, showed an unusual spike in manual price overrides. One or two entries on their own could be dismissed as routine corrections. But Daniel wasn't looking at isolated incidents. He was staring at a trend so precise, so deliberate, it might as well have been carved into stone. His mind scrambled to connect the timing of those overrides with another oddity he had overlooked until now: security footage issues. He pulled up the maintenance log and cross-referenced the dates. There it was. Multiple alerts for footage corruption and incomplete backup during the exact windows those overrides occurred. His stomach dropped. He'd been told by Sarah, his trusted systems supervisor, that these were software bugs. Harmless, she had said. Normal, given the age of their hardware. Daniel had believed her. Of course he had. Sarah had helped oversee the rollout of their new cloud-integrated point-of-sale system. She'd been instrumental in customizing the internal access permissions and backup intervals. And now, buried in the logs, Daniel found the nail that sealed the coffin. Sarah's employee ID attached to a scheduled update for the following week, one that would automatically purge transaction logs older than 30 days. It was like watching the end of a magic trick and finally seeing how the illusion worked. Sarah hadn't just known where the holes were, she had designed them. With one click, she had scheduled an update that would neatly erase the very data Daniel now needed to prove what had been happening. He stared at the timestamp. 2:14 a.m., 3 nights ago. Scheduled without his approval, without his knowledge. Her justification? Performance optimization. A note in the metadata read. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. Sarah, Linda, Chris, Mark, and now possibly Jake. Each name once brought him a sense of pride. Now each syllable tasted like ash. His store hadn't just been compromised, it had been infiltrated. Daniel took a slow breath, forcing his thoughts into order. Panic wouldn't serve him now. Precision would. He switched from the management app to his notes app, opening a clean document. The title, Evidence Log, Internal Theft. With every entry, he added the date, the time, the employee ID, the register number, the product involved, and the nature of the fraud. Manual override, void manipulation, false damaged goods, or corrupted surveillance. He attached screenshots of the reports, linked receipts from inventory loss records, and even audio transcriptions where his memory was fresh enough to recall phrases word for word. The boss never checks. Cameras in aisle 5 are glitchy. Blended in. Wah, it was all being recorded now, not in whispers, but in hard data. As he worked, he began to see the web in full. The override patterns weren't random, they formed a rhythm. Chris often worked the early shifts with Linda. Mark would clock in mid-morning and hang around the storage and camera servers. Sarah's digital footprints were lighter, but always aligned with system changes, updates, log removals, maintenance windows. They had created a system of checks and balances, not to prevent theft, but to execute it flawlessly. Each roll in their ring was surgical. Each action was disguised as standard procedure. They'd built a shadow company inside of Brooks General Market, and for months, maybe longer, it had been thriving right under Daniel's nose. He leaned back, phone resting against his thigh, heart thudding in quiet anger. The betrayal was complete. Not just professional, but deeply personal. These people weren't strangers. They were the ones who had shared birthday cakes with him in the break room, laughed over team-building retreats, leaned on him during personal emergencies. And yet, behind his back, they'd turned his business into their own secret economy. Daniel glanced at the corner clock above the employee hallway. Another transaction override would likely be happening soon if the pattern held, but this time he wouldn't just watch. He would document. He would compile. He would prepare. Because now he knew the truth, and the next time he entered the office, he wouldn't be a passive owner trying to protect a dream. He would be a man armed with evidence, ready to take back what had been stolen in silence. The morning air was crisp and sharp, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Daniel Brooks. As he stepped out of his car and crossed the parking lot of Brooks General Market, there was no trace of the weary, hooded man who had walked those aisles in silence days earlier. Today, Daniel wore his sharpest grey suit, the same one he'd worn the day the store opened 15 years ago. His shoes shined, his tie was straight, and under his arm he carried a thick vanilla folder. Inside, it was no contract or business plan, but something far more important. Truth. Hard, undeniable, carefully documented truth. The weight of it wasn't just physical, it radiated through his spine with every step he took through those familiar sliding doors. The staff barely had time to register his entrance. A few offered polite greetings, their voices tinged with surprise. Daniel rarely arrived before mid-morning and never unannounced. But today was different. Without breaking stride, he walked past the registers, past the manager's desk, and straight into the main office. A moment later, his voice carried across the store's intercom, firm, unwavering. Emergency staff meeting in the office. 15 minutes. Amanda, Linda, Chris, Mark, Jake. This includes you. The message echoed across the polished floors and into the break room, sending a ripple of confusion through the morning crew. Phones paused mid-scroll, boxes were left half unpacked, glances were exchanged. Something was wrong. Everyone could feel it. The office was silent when they began to file in, one by one. Amanda, clutching her apron, eyes darting. Jake, pale and wide-eyed, unsure of his place in all of this. Mark with a guarded posture, arms crossed. Chris, slower than usual, his usual grin conspicuously absent. And finally, Linda, composed as always. But Daniel caught the tightness around her eyes as she took the last open seat. The folder hit the table with a soft but unmistakable thud. Daniel didn't sit. He stood behind the table like a prosecutor, his hands planted firmly on either side of the evidence. I've always believed, he began slowly, that trust is the foundation of any business, that treating people like family builds loyalty you can't buy. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Yesterday, I learned exactly how wrong I was. He opened the folder and began distributing pages, highlighted transaction logs, printed screenshots of camera feeds, system entries tagged with employee IDs. Would anyone like to explain, he said, his voice still calm, why our premium coffee is regularly sold at 60% below retail, but only during certain shifts? He looked directly at Linda, whose hand hovered just above the paperwork, her face unreadable. Or why our surveillance footage from those same time slots has been mysteriously corrupted. Mark? Mark's gaze dropped, but he said nothing. Chris, would you care to tell the room why your override entries perfectly align with every special customer discount we've recorded in the past 2 months? Chris's jaw tightened. Jake looked like he might be sick. Daniel walked slowly behind their chairs, each footstep deliberate. I've built this store from the ground up. I helped you with your mum's surgery, Chris. I paid for your braces, Jake. I hosted Amanda's launch party for her bakery at cost. His voice cracked slightly, then steadied again. And this is how I'm repaid. With organized theft? With systems created behind my back? With my own security infrastructure used against me? He stopped beside Linda. And you, the person I trusted most, You helped me draft our loss prevention protocol. Now I find your name attached to a scheduled system purge that would have erased every trace of this." Her composure fractured, her lips trembling as she opened her mouth, but no words came out. The room was suffocating with silence. Even the usual sounds from the store outside felt distant, muffled by the gravity pressing down inside that office. No one denied it. They couldn't. The evidence was too precise, too damning, too complete. Some turned pale. Others looked at the floor. The very people Daniel had leaned on, celebrated with, cried with, now sat exposed under a light they could no longer dim. The scale of it all was clear now. Not a few discounts here or there, not one rogue employee, but a coordinated ring of trusted insiders, manipulating prices, erasing logs, and stealing with a smile. The depth of the betrayal left Daniel momentarily speechless. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because there was so much to say, and none of it would undo what had been done. The silence in the office hung like fog, thick and unmoving. Daniel stood at the front of the room, hands resting on the final sheet of paper in the folder, the one he had hoped he'd never need to pull out. But hope had been stripped from him over the last 72 hours, layer by layer, until all that remained was clarity and resolve. He looked up at the group gathered before him, faces that once radiated trust, now pale with fear, guilt, and a creeping sense of inevitability. Then, like a dam cracking under pressure, the first voice broke through the stillness. "I only did it twice," Jake blurted, eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't know how far it went. Linda said it was normal, that everyone did it to help regular customers." His voice cracked. "I thought I was doing a good thing." Daniel watched him carefully, not with sympathy but with a measured gaze. Jake was young, impressionable, and clearly shaken. He had been manipulated, folded into the scheme not by malice, but by fear and pressure. "Jake," Daniel said, his tone firm but not unkind, "your age doesn't excuse your actions, but it does explain them. You'll receive a 2-week suspension without pay. When you return, you'll be under direct supervision for 6 months. You'll undergo mandatory ethics training, and you'll work every shift, knowing that one more misstep ends your time here, permanently." Jake nodded silently, his face red with shame, but also with a strange kind of relief. Relief that he hadn't been cast out entirely. Daniel turned next to Amanda, who had sat frozen since the meeting began. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the transaction logs that showed her name linked to dozens of heavily discounted bulk orders. "I thought it was harmless," she whispered. "Linda told me it was just a quiet favor, like a neighborhood thing, a way to help small businesses stay afloat." She looked up, eyes watery. "I didn't think it was stealing." Daniel held her gaze. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he replied. "And loyalty to this store goes beyond your own bottom line." He took a slow breath. "Amanda, you're suspended for 1 month. When you return, it will be under probation for another 3. You will report directly to management, and you will help us rewrite the vendor policy you helped undermine." The room shifted as Daniel stepped closer to the remaining 3. "Chris," he said, voice colder now, "you looked me in the eye the day I signed off on your raise. You told me this job meant everything, and yet you made it your personal discount club." Chris didn't speak. His jaw clenched, his eyes hard. "You're done here," Daniel continued. "Effective immediately. Clean out your locker. Security will escort you out. Your final paycheck will be adjusted for the damages tied to your employee ID." Then his eyes flicked to Mark, who sat slumped in his chair, arms still crossed. "And you," Daniel said quietly, "deleted surveillance footage from a system you were paid to maintain. You didn't just look the other way. You helped cover the tracks. That makes you just as guilty. You're fired. No appeal." Then Daniel turned to Linda. She hadn't moved since the start of the meeting. She sat rigid, hands folded in her lap, the only thing betraying her calm exterior being the quiver in her bottom lip. "Linda," Daniel began, and this time the emotion in his voice was undeniable. "You were the architect. You didn't just allow this. You designed it. You used my trust as a weapon. You exploited your position, manipulated systems you helped build, and taught others how to steal from the place that paid your bills. He opened the final folder and placed it on the table, an official police report, partially filled out, awaiting only a signature. You're not just fired. You're being reported to law enforcement. I'll be pressing charges for theft, fraud, and digital manipulation of business records. For the first time, Linda's composure broke. Daniel, please, she began, but he held up a hand. No, this is beyond apology. You'll hear from my lawyer. As security stepped in to escort the terminated employees out, Daniel turned to those still seated, the ones who hadn't spoken but had clearly listened. Starting today, he said, this store is no longer a place where silence is loyalty. We will rebuild with transparency, accountability, and systems that serve honesty, not hide theft. He paused, allowing his words to settle into the stunned air. We'll audit everything. We'll change procedures. But more than that, we'll change the culture. Because what happened here wasn't just a failure of controls, it was a failure of trust. And that ends now. The meeting ended not with applause, but with a deep, heavy silence, one that marked the end of one chapter and the fragile beginning of another. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Brooks General Market before the sun had risen. The parking lot was still empty, the sky painted in muted shades of grey and gold. As he stood before the front doors, key in hand, he no longer felt like a man trying to save a crumbling store. He felt like a builder standing at the foundation of something new, something harder, yes, but something truer. The echoes of yesterday's reckoning still lingered in the air, and the store felt different, emptier in some ways, but also cleaner, as if a heavy fog had finally lifted. Daniel stepped inside with a binder tucked under his arm. The new operating manual for Brooks General Market. It was heavier than the last one, full of reforms, safeguards, and a vision shaped by hard-earned lessons. Within days, change swept across the store like a tide. New protocols were implemented, daily transaction audits by a rotating team, real-time alerts on price overrides, and weekly inventory reviews with mandatory double signatures. Cameras were upgraded to cloud-based, high-resolution systems with off-site backups. Every digital login now required multi-factor authentication. Staff access was tiered, no more blanket permissions. Every employee was retrained, every system restructured. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about punishment, it was about clarity. Daniel no longer wanted a workplace that ran on blind trust and unspoken expectations. He wanted one where trust was earned, measured, and protected by design. As he walked through the aisles, observing the cautious but cooperative energy from remaining staff, he felt something else return for the first time in months. Control. But not everyone embraced the new order. Word spread quickly, among staff, among vendors, and especially among customers. Some were shocked to discover the special prices they had come to expect were no longer quietly honored. Amanda's bakery orders went through the proper channels now, and they cost more. A handful of customers, those who had benefited from backroom favors, stopped showing up entirely. A few left negative online reviews, muttering about how the store had lost its neighborhood charm. Daniel read everyone, and then he let them go. Because for every departing customer, there was another who came forward, shaking his hand, thanking him for standing up for integrity. They respected the changes, even if they didn't say it aloud. They noticed, and they stayed. In the break room, conversations shifted. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now discussed openly during morning huddles. New employees were vetted with background checks and trained in not just policy, but ethics. Jake, humbled but determined, became a quiet example of second chances done right. Amanda kept to herself at first, but eventually took ownership of her mistakes, helping to develop vendor transparency practices that became store policy. Slowly, the culture changed. It was less family and more team, less based on blind loyalty and more on earned respect. And for Daniel, that was enough. The warmth that returned to the store wasn't artificial. It was cautious, deliberate, and real. 6 months passed. Daniel sat in his office reviewing the quarterly financials. For the first time in a long time, the numbers made sense. The revenue was steady. Profit margins were back on track. But more than that, shrinkage, the silent bleed that had once drained his store, was almost non-existent. Inventory matched records. Overrides were rare. Customer satisfaction scores were climbing. The store wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was honest. It was sustainable. As Daniel looked through the glass wall into the heart of the store, the aisles, the staff, the steady rhythm of honest work, he felt a sense of peace. Not comfort, not ease, but peace. The kind that comes when you stop pretending everything is fine and finally do the hard work of fixing what's broken. He thought back to the early days, when Brooks General Market was just a vision in his head and a lease in his pocket. Back then, he believed that if you treated people like family, they would never betray you. He now knew better. Trust, he had learned, was not a gift to be handed out freely, but a resource, valuable, finite, and in need of constant care. It had to be protected by systems, policies, and yes, even surveillance. But that didn't make it cynical. It made it responsible. As the store buzzed around him, Daniel leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare smile. The betrayal had nearly broken him, but the rebuild had made him stronger. And from now on, Brooks General Market would stand not just on loyalty, but on vigilance, structure, and a new kind of trust. One that didn't need to be blind to be real. If this story moved you or opened your eyes to the unseen challenges within everyday workplaces, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. We're committed to uncovering powerful, thought-provoking stories that reveal the hidden truths behind trust, betrayal, and resilience. Join our community to explore more narratives that dig beneath the surface, where real change begins with one honest look.